So welcome all to today's seminar series called Cutting Edge Advances Towards Personalized Mental Health, hosted by our Center for Precision Mental Health and Wellness. I am Dr. Leonardo Tozzi, and I am a co-director of the seminar series along with Dr. Xue Zhang. I'll kick off with a couple of housekeeping items, and then after that, we'll introduce today's speaker. The webinar will be about 40 to 45 minutes with an additional 10-15 minutes for Q&A. It's being recorded now, and we will post it to our website next week. If you're interested in previous seminar talks, you can find our website in the chat or scan the QR code on the left side of the screen that you see there for our in-person attendees. From there, you can also sign up to receive announcements about our future seminars and events. If you're interested to join our center as a research member, please see the link in the chat or scan the QR code on the right screen to fill in a survey, and we'll get back to you. So that's the QR code for our in-person attendees. For in-person attendees, please raise your hand if you have a pressing question. And for virtual attendees, please put your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll attend to those at the end of the presentation. I encourage you to put the questions as early as possible, and they will be addressed in order. Now, I would like to hand over the mic to Dr. Nir Eshel, who is the Associate Director of Translational Neuroscience of our center, to introduce our special keynote speaker, Dr. Liam Mason. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. So I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker today. Dr. Liam Mason is a neuroscientist and a clinical psychologist based at the Max Planck UCL Center for Computational Psychiatry. He's currently spending the summer at University of California, Berkeley, our illustrious neighboring institution in the East Bay. He has not one, but two doctorates to his name, one from the University of Manchester, right, and the other from King's College London. In both cases, he used advanced neuroimaging technologies to tackle important clinical problems in psychiatry. In the first doctorate, searching for an endophenotype for bipolar disorder. And in the second, untangling the neural mechanisms of which psychotherapies are going to be successful. In 2019, he moved to University College London, where he founded a bipolar disorder clinic and has been recently promoted to Associate Professor of Clinical Psychology. And today, he's going to discuss neurocomputational mechanisms driving mood and reward dysregulation in bipolar disorder. Thanks so much for joining us, Liam.
Can people hear me okay with the mic? Yeah. Well, thank you, Nir, for such a kind introduction. It's really great to be here, and thank you for making me feel at home when I'm obviously very far from my home in London. So yeah, it's fantastic. I had a little car trouble getting here, involved jump-starting a flat battery. So I'm especially relieved to have arrived. And on that note, I also wanted to thank Leonardo for, in terms of jump-starting things, you really helped set everything up and made things go so smoothly. So thank you for that. So yeah, I'm going to start with my talk. The first thing I'm going to say is and sort of answer the question of kind of why Icarus. So this was a metaphor that someone in my clinic used for their bipolar disorder. So if people are not familiar with the fable of Icarus, Icarus was a man who wanted to reach his goal, very lofty goal of trying to fly close to the sun. To accomplish this, he had some wings fashioned, and he flew off, and up he went. And as he climbed and soared higher and higher, he felt, euphoric, extremely confident. And unfortunately, that was his downfall in the fable. He, in the end, flew too close to the sun, and the heat melted the wax on his wings. And unfortunately, he came plummeting back down. So it was quite a powerful metaphor that sort of stuck with me and useful for sort of thinking about these kind of quite marked changes in mood that we see in folks with bipolar disorder. And I guess the key thing that I wanted to highlight is the world around us doesn't necessarily need to change for our perception of it to change, and sometimes drastically. And this kind of mood bias is something that I'm going to focus my talk about today. So in part one, I'm going to give you some theory and background on the computational framework that we've been developing. I'm going to talk about some work, 3 pieces of empirical work. The first will be looking at mood and how that biases momentary confidence via perception of reward. We're going to talk about this new digital tool we've been developing for longitudinal studies called the Happiness Project. And then I'm going to talk about some model-based fMRI and EEG work, looking to sort of isolate the loci of the mood bias that I'm going to tell you about. So I implore you to stop me if you have questions, especially to any more junior members here. If things are not clear, it's almost certainly because I'm not doing a great job of explaining them, and I'd be delighted to answer any questions. So I'll kick off firstly with what we mean by a generative computational model, because computational models come in a couple of different flavors. There's an example here of how we can kind of map a real world problem. So I didn't enjoy that as much as I thought I would. Should I do it again? And we can sort of think about how this filters through a kind of black box and through kind of neural processes into the sort of behavior that we, let me go over here. No, over here. So the sort of behavioral output that we might see, like in experiments that we might run. And we have this kind of like, we want to couch this computationally or algorithmically with tasks that we use. So common one is a sort of reinforcement learning paradigm, which I will unpack a lot more. And this, of course, disappears into something of a black box. And I guess that's the bit that I'm going to try to demystify a little bit today. We, in the end, can specify these things in quite a rigorous mechanistic way. There's a lot of advantages. I'm going to try to convince you of that there's a lot of advantages of doing that, especially in clinical phenomena too. And of course, these things we know we can then kind of better investigate where they're occurring in the brain and the circuits that are involved. If I have time at the end, I'll talk a little bit about kind of implications for therapies, both pharmacological and psychological. Okay, so let's just get cracking with the science of today. So the idea of mood bias here, like a relatable example that you may have come across before is if you go to a new restaurant for the first time, you've never been there before and you happen to be in a really good mood, you're likely to perceive the meal as being even better than it actually is, such that if you go back on another day, you're likely to get kind of disappointed with it. And here, like the core example, the core idea is that mood is somehow biasing the reward value of that meal or of that experience, and that people might be more prone to that. And there was some really seminal work by Eran Elder, a good friend and collaborator of mine, who did this work at Princeton, who examined how rewards, how they're represented in places like the ventral striatum, and used an elegant mood induction while people were in the scanner, which I will say a little bit more about. What he found, which is kind of intuitive, but also incredibly thrilling to find in kind of an empirical experiment, is that the amount that people's mood changed predicted how responsive their ventral striatal activations were to the same reward. So they're always getting the same reward. If people are induced into a positive mood, it somehow increases that. If they're in a negative mood, it decreases it. So that's something that we've really tried to build on and sort of think with a bit of clinical acumen about in terms of applying that to bipolar disorder. So just like in the sort of Icarus fable of kind of elevated mood being associated with euphoria, confidence, risk-taking, and drive towards goals, we start off in the model with a positive surprise, which I'm going to unpack as a reward prediction error. And this could be anything that happens, in daily life, something that is slightly better than expected. And this sets off a cascade of a change in mood, followed by a bias in perception of subsequent experiences. And you can see here that this forms a sort of recursive cycle or a vicious cycle in which that change and sort of bias of subsequent rewards being perceived as better than they are leads to further escalation of mood. I've got some simulation data that I'll show you in a second to kind of unpack this a bit more. In the model, there becomes a tipping point. So expectations have climbed to such a high degree that the sort of objective feedback from the environment cannot actually meet those high expectations. And negative surprises become increasingly likely. And that sets off a sort of cascade you can imagine in the opposite direction. So it's a very simple model, but I'm hopefully going to convince you that it's possibly a useful model. So if you think about like reinforcement learning experiments, we know there's essentially 3 stages. So you'll choose an option within a task based on its value at that time. You'll evaluate how the outcome was compared to what you expected, and then you'll update your expectations. Should I choose that again? Should I do that action again? Within the evaluate part, you process the outcome, and you generate a reward prediction error, which is the difference from what you're expecting to how it actually was. And this cycle has been used a lot. There's various models that implement it. And the nice thing well, we can see in the top right corner is if you don't have a propensity for mood to bias this process at all, you can see that your expectations start off kind of neutral in blue and eventually climb to the true reward value of what you're learning. So over many hundred trials, you quite quickly work out its actual reward value and you don't deviate from that. And your prediction errors start off high initially, but then they drop down to very little. So what happens if we add into the model a propensity for mood to bias things? So here we have this term, which is mood being formalized as momentum. So the momentum here refers to an integration of the past experiences and reward prediction errors. And this term is positive whenever there have been several positive prediction errors in one go. And it essentially signals that the environment is improving. And vice versa, if it's negative, it signals that the environment is worsening. And the crucial thing is, in our model, we allow that mood or momentum term to bias the perception of subsequent rewards. And you end up with, in contrast to an unbiased model, you end up with this term, which is a reward bias. So the value is somehow increased or decreased by current mood. And as a function of that, the reward prediction error is also shifted up or shifted down depending on the person's mood. I can unpack that a little bit more in sort of text, if that's easier for people. So we use a standard kind of Q-learning or Scholar-Wagner learning model. And we have the reward prediction error being the subjective reward, so the perceived reward. And we have that being modulated by a free parameter for mood bias and their mood at that moment. Okay, so if you simulate a model where there is at least a weak mood bias, so that free parameter in the top right corner here is slightly positive, you don't end up with this sort of nice stable learning pattern. You start to have a sort of oscillating pattern, right? Because you have this momentum of mood that is biasing experiences, that's shifting expectations up too high, and then you're kind of correcting for that, and then they go too low. And you can see that as you increase that parameter in these simulations, those dynamics in terms of mood and expectation become more extreme, more marked. Any questions about that before I go on to the empirical data that hopefully substantiates some of the weird and wonderful simulation data? Okay. So now I'm going to talk about some empirical work. I'm just going to move this in case that's making some feedback. So yeah, as I alluded to before, you can use a task in which you're learning the value, in this case of two kind of neutral pictures that didn't have any value until people were learning through trial and error their value. They receive some monetary rewards, so I believe that is 5 English pence. I guess that's, yeah, somewhere between 5 and 10 American cents. We add into this a mood induction. So here they spin a wheel in which they can they can win a much larger amount or lose a much larger amount. We rig it so that they win one of the higher prizes, and that generates obviously a large positive prediction error if they win on the Wheel of Fortune, and has a measurable effect on their mood. And then we get them to repeat the task that they're doing before, but with 2 new stimuli. And the key thing is the reward probability is identical objectively. So there's no reason why these should be learned any differently if mood is not playing a role. But as you can sort of see with this sort of funky green outline, our expectation is that there's something about a positive mood that is going to supercharge the sort of learning or the value of those stimuli, such that if you ask them at the end of the learning blocks, which did they prefer between the various pairs that you can get from these 2 between block comparisons, what we find is there's a general propensity for people to prefer the stimulus post mood induction if they were in a positive mood, or before if they were in a negative mood. I'll show you in a second, it's very weak at the group level, but it becomes increasingly potent as you factor in individual difference, such as vulnerability to bipolar disorder. And in this task, we're also sampling people's subjective ratings of mood as we go along, and they're very useful for comparing to the model estimates when we fit those. So as I was saying, it's almost this kind of initially disappointing effect, right? So on the y-axis here, you've got their preference being shifted towards the second mood, the second block with increasingly positive values, or shifted towards the first block if they preferred before the mood induction. And you can see that overall, there's not really much of an effect. And that would usually be disappointing, but because I'm interested in individual difference, that's actually not such a bad thing. And what we find is the amount that people have a bias towards the more positive mood block is very predicted by hypomanic personality traits, which is one measure of psychometric vulnerability for bipolar. And you can see it quite beautifully illustrated in this graph here. So I'm having some trouble pointing, but you can see here that the amount that people shift their preference towards the post-mood induction block is associated with how many their score, I should say, on the hypomanic personality scale. And you can see that's positively correlated under the positive mood and negatively correlated under negative mood. So I think from this, we got very excited and we thought, okay, well, let's try to fit some models that explain how this is happening. So here we expect that our mood bias parameter should be able to capture the degree to which people are biased towards stimuli under positive mood. This is the sort of recap of the model in the top right corner. And we fit a bunch of models, a sort of standard model, which doesn't allow mood to be affected and to vary. A sort of intermediary model, which we call the one-way moody reinforcement learning model, which allows outcomes to affect your mood, but doesn't allow mood to affect your subsequent perception of outcomes. And a sort of full recursive model, which is the one that's in the top right corner, in which mood is affected by outcomes, and that mood is affecting your perception of subsequent outcomes. And what we found in this first experiment is, again, this mood bias parameter is nicely capturing the extent of bias in the task. So it seems to be very involved in this. So per the model, we think that momentary changes in mood are biasing reward valuation. And hypomanic traits seem to be associated with an excessive propensity towards that as a bias or as a mechanism. So this is now a bit of a clumsy segue. I'm trying to kind of get to another experiment that we ran. So this is a master student, Sasha Volk, who wanted to know about people's confidence during these sorts of experiments. So, yeah.
When you talk about changes in mood, have you tried to induce mood in a way that's unrelated to the task? But in this sense, you're giving them more money, a task that involves money.
Yeah.
And I wonder if there's effects related to how much money they feel like they already have or they're reaching it. Is there other ways of inducing mood that might be more independent or orthogonal?
Yes, it's a great question. So I'll show you some data a bit later on that doesn't use money. There are a few other ways that can be done that are kind of more complex and harder to kind of include in the model. So sometimes people have used kind of music, they've used kind of video clips that, to your point, kind of things that are domain general and out of the kind of reward kind of wealth kind of space. We've also tried this with having people do quizzes where they have to guess the right answer, and we give them kind of erroneous feedback that kind of makes them feel like they're doing better than they actually are doing. So there are a bunch of ways of doing it, and that is an important confound. The only downside to using those other methods is they're very difficult to kind of integrate within the modeling, right? So the nice thing about using monetary reward in this Wheel of Fortune is it's scalable with the rewards within the task. So we can model that as a trial of learning. So we can capture that as a rule prediction error.
This second question, is there a symmetry between the two vicious cycles, the positive and the negative, in terms of maybe there's yet another parameter you add to the model in which some people are really responsive and get easily into the positive cycle and not into the negative one, or vice versa? Or is this model, is it kind of the same bias regardless whether it's positive or negative?
Yeah, again, that's great. That goes to some work that we're doing at the moment in a larger sample. What we tend to find is people are more inducible into negative mood. There's something, I guess it's in the spirit of kind of prospect theory that kind of losses and negative outcomes sort of loom larger than rewards. We are looking at this in a longitudinal study to see whether, mood bias parameter is stronger under one than the other. So far, what we tend to find is that the values are kind of similar, actually, in terms of even the mood may shift more under a negative mood. The amount that then is biasing subsequent value is about the same between the two. But that's at the sort of population level, right? And I kind of think there's some really intriguing work to do there, maybe in folks with sort of unipolar depression or kind of other disorders where you might expect it to be kind of more in one domain and more asymmetric, I guess. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, Sasha was interested in momentary confidence throughout our experiments, and there's a few ways that you can think about kind of formalizing what confidence is. You could be kind of confident over the reward likelihood of either of these options, sort of signified by the blue lines. So that would be kind of confidence as the sort of precision over the mean reward of those two options. But we were actually interested in this orangey line between the two. So we're thinking of confidence in the experiment as how well you're able to separate which is the good option and the bad option. So that's what he asked our participants to do multiple times throughout the experiment. How confident are you about which is the better option? And we were asking the question of whether mood can bias that quantity, right? Whether when you're in a good mood, that also makes you overly confident. And again, whether that relates to our individual difference measure. So what we found was that, as we expected, a positive mood made people more confident in the second block relative to the first block, and a negative mood did the opposite. And again, we had this very interesting interaction with hypomanic traits. So that effect was larger in people with higher levels of hypomanic traits. And when we looked at how this unfolded, this was something that we were not expecting. I guess we kind of intuitively thought that the effect of mood biasing confidence would be maximal when their mood is at its peak. So immediately after the mood induction, we thought that's when people are going to have a bigger bias on their confidence. What we actually found, and sorry, that's what you see on the right-hand plot here, right? That mood is very different initially as you go into block 2, and then starts to kind of return back to baseline towards the end of that. But it's actually the sort of mirror opposite, the mirror of that in terms of the confidence difference. It seems to sort of slowly accumulate as people go through that second block of learning, such that the overconfidence really emerges in the sort of latter part of the experiment. So what we reasoned was that if we fit a standard model where we're looking at people's Q values for the options, we're kind of imagining that the confidence at any given moment is the difference between the Q values of the two available options at the time, right? So in this first participant in the top left, we'd kind of predict that on average, they're not actually very confident about being able to separate which is the good option and the bad option. This participant here seems to have done a better job of learning, and there's a much bigger gap between the Q values. So we expected that this person would be more confident, but also that it would kind of increase towards the end of the experiment. And that's formalized here in terms of the absolute difference between the available Q values on each trial. And what we found was that it was a very strong predictor of people's self-reported confidence as they went through the experiment. So here we're looking at the beta weight for the Q value difference, predicting their ratings and confidence, and finding that yeah, almost everybody is having a positive coefficient for that beta. And overall, it seemed to be fitting with what we were expecting there. I'm just going to, I think, in essence of time, I'm going to skip over this part about the model comparison, quickly show you some simulations of the model that we were looking at before. And you can see in this plot, if this is if the first part is block 1, then you have the mood induction, and the second part is block 2. We simulated again a non-moody model, a one-way moody model, and a model which I'm going to focus on, which is this sort of orange model or yellow model. And here, these models are allowing mood to bias the Q values directly. So let me just actually bring up the slide again. So here, it's in these models, mood is still biasing the reward value of each of these options. And we think that that is what's going to be predictive of the sort of difference of confidence throughout the experiment. And you can see in the simulations that that seems to be the case, right? That if you look at this sort of moody model, there's a kind of slow increase in kind of overconfidence when you contrast the positive from negative mood learning, and that peaks a little bit later. And it seems to fit quite nicely with the kind of the non-modeling finding that we have. So can this model, original model, explain jointly the bias on mood affecting reward value and this sort of bias on kind of confidence over or under confidence? And again, when we fit that, to the empirical data, we seem to get pretty good evidence that this model is the one that people are using. And in terms of accounting for the basic effects in the task, we saw already that on the left, either of these moody models, I only fully articulated the orange one, but this seems to be correlating with their bias in terms of raw perception. But it also nicely picks up the kind of mood effect on confidence that I showed you before. So again, a stronger mood bias on the x-axis is predicting a greater effect of the mood induction on the change in confidence between the two blocks. Any questions about that before I go on to the next part? Yeah.
So maybe just so that I can understand, what are you trying to say at a larger level that in both the case of confidence and reward valuation, there's a two-way street such that if you have a high mood, you're more confident that you value rewards higher, and then when you value rewards higher or have higher confidence, then your mood is likely to improve. So in both cases, it's a cycle as opposed to a one-way.
Yeah, that's something that I guess I haven't fully decided on, but yeah, I guess there's a couple of ways, right, that mood could be making us overconfident. It's either there's a sort of direct bonus that's applied kind of after you've got your kind of estimates of the available options, or it's actually acting indirectly through the key values. What I guess we're saying is it seems like the common kind of propensity for mood to bias reward perception is actually accounting for both of the phenomena.
Actually, it's one effect.
One effect, yeah. But it's an interesting question about whether there's a kind of confirmation bias that kind of kicks in, right? As you get more confident, that is also kind of biasing. These models don't exactly capture that. It seems sufficient that the bias in terms of reward value and learning is accounting for kind of both phenomena, okay? Yeah.
And I guess another bigger level, like when you say evaluation, you say learning, is there a way to disentangle those? Like if they're already fully learned, you still, in a positive mood state, can you still untangle the effect of mood on evaluation of some object that you're already at a kind of plateau?
Yeah, I guess we've only really run these with sort of relatively brief experiments, right? So like the bulk, and partly that's a practical kind of constraint, right? We want to kind of do the learning while their mood is still kind of deviated as a result of the mood induction. But is your question if you were then to, I don't know, bring them back kind of subsequently with well-learned stimuli and have them do more trials of learning, or?
Yeah, because I can imagine in the bipolar disorder case, it's not as if the always new things to learn in your environment, whether you're in a positive or a negative mood state or a manic or a depressive episode.
Right.
Rather, the same stimuli that in the positive, in the manic episode seem super exciting, seem super not exciting, super boring, super not engaging if you're in a depressed state. So
yeah.
It's the same well-learned.
Got you.
And so it's not so much, doesn't seem to me it's all about learning.
Yeah.
It seems like there might be a different aspect to it that's kind of changing the valuation of an object that is well known.
Yeah, well, I guess so. In that,
oh, sorry.
In that, so I mean, I think that leads to a really interesting kind of experiment which we haven't run, which is kind of using the same stimuli and after inducing one mood, seeing if we can induce a different mood. But I would probably still think of that as relearning, right? They're sort of still learning, even though they're relatively well kind of learned at that point. They're still probabilistic, as with, I guess, events in our daily life. But it's an intriguing question about whether we would be able to kind of modulate the reward in the opposite direction with a different mood, under a different mood state. We haven't really had too much success in kind of multiple mood inductions in kind of the experiments we've run, but it's something that we could look at, I think. Okay, so we then look to replicate this in a slightly larger sample. So we put this up on OSF with our predictions. In a larger sample, we found essentially the same thing again, that there's this sort of deviation in people's confidence following mood induction, which we're thrilled about. And we seem to unpick a very similar kind of association in the second study to the one that I told you about already, where the amount of hypomanic traits that participants had was predicting kind of greater response of mood on confidence, a greater effect of positive mood in terms of increasing that, and similarly, negative mood affecting their confidence too. So we're still looking at kind of modeling that second data set, but what I think we can conclude so far from this is that moods seem to bias our perception of reward and reward likelihood. This mechanism accounts for a tendency for mood to bias momentary confidence as well. So it's quite nice that we have a kind of parsimonious model here that maybe accounts for two relevant phenomena in bipolar disorder. The influence on mood and confidence appears to be something that's very relevant, as I said, to bipolar vulnerability. And I guess clinically it would sort of start to highlight mood's effects on kind of overconfidence as an important target, perhaps more so than, or in addition to mood making things feel more rewarding or more enticing. It seems to also point towards making people more overly confident about their ability to obtain rewards as well, and vice versa in depression or unipolar depressive episodes too. To say like how this work is being taken forward at the moment, I have a recent PhD student, Ilinka, who is running a longitudinal study in some folks with bipolar. And I think this will be, it's an 8-week study, so it will be a really good opportunity for us to look at the kinds of queries I think that you had near as well. So yeah, I will report back about those. Okay, so in terms of the next part of the talk, I'm just very briefly going to say about this tool that we've been developing. So this is with collaborator Rob Rutledge, who is at Yale. And we developed a smartphone app that has a bunch of these gamified cognitive tasks or affective probes within it. We put this up on the App Store and took a sort of citizen science approach in terms of having people download this and kindly give us their data for scientific questions. And again, we wanted to just see whether these effects can kind of replicate in a larger sample. But more than that, I was very keen that we could have a sort of portable tool that will work. In longitudinal studies, it only takes about 5 minutes, and it's something that we can kind of look at in relation to interventions too. So I would love to show you how we gamified that. It's a kind of nice little game. You could always download it, or I could potentially show it people later on as well. But yes, I should carry on with my talk and just say that we managed to replicate a couple of effects already in this larger sample. So Ilinka found that the amount that people's mood changes as a result of this Wheel of Fortune, where they're winning gems instead of money, was predictive of the degree in which they preferred the post mood induction options again. And again, we found some evidence that this was stronger in people with higher levels of trait hypomania in this larger sample. We're still finessing the analyses here because when you get very large online data sets, there's a lot of additional noise and variability to kind of include in there. But it seems that on kind of an initial fit, our model still seems to pan out okay, is still the best supported. It further appears that we're able to kind of capture people's mood. So this is the degree to which the model is accurately predicting people's self-reported happiness throughout the experiment. And you can see that on average, the correlation is pretty good with a few people who are not fit so well. We're still looking to refine that. And just very quickly, again, the mood bias parameter that I've been talking about so far seems to do a good job of capturing this sort of block preference or block bias. So when it is stronger, when the mood bias parameter is stronger under positive mood, it predicts greater preference again for the post mood induction options, and vice versa for negative mood. Okay, so just to quickly tell you about how we're situating that within our other studies, we're using this sort of portable digital tool. We're using some EMA and we're using some functional imaging in a variety of our studies. The one that I mentioned about already with Ilinka, but also some pharmacological studies as well. So Anais and Millie, shown here on the left, have been looking at the effects of SSRI and L-DOPA on these tasks, and we're thrilled about what we might find there. In terms of kind of the neuroimaging stuff, that leads me to the last part of the talk, which hopefully I still have some time for, which is looking at kind of this model-based fMRI approach. and seeing whether we can pick up these sort of mood-biased reward prediction errors in the brain. So for this task, it's actually a secondary analysis of an earlier paper that we had in folks with bipolar disorder. And here we have a roulette task where people are kind of placing bets on various different colors. It's not ideally suited to a learning model, but I'd be happy to talk a little bit more about the modifications that we made there. And the context of this, I guess, is if you look in the neuroimaging literature of reward hypersensitivity and bipolar disorder, it's quite varied. So even if you're scanning people who are outside of mood episodes, some studies find there is hypersensitivity to reward, some find the opposite, some find no difference. So since my paper up here almost 10 years ago now, there have been a bunch of studies that kind of go in various different directions. And that's kind of surprising because I guess personally, I feel like there is likely to be a sort of trait hypersensitivity to reward that is sort of accounting for people's sort of goal striving during elevated mood. But I think it points to maybe this sort of issue of how reward and fMRI studies are often approached, which is to sort of average the reward responses throughout the experiment, throughout the time series. And I think model-based fMRI is quite nice because we can get a bit more precision there. We allow reward responses to oscillate, right? So at different parts of the time series of the experiment, if our model is correct, it will predict that the reward responses are being shifted up or dampened down, and crucially at kind of predictable parts of the time series. So if you're scanning somebody for 30 or 40 minutes, I guess our model allows the kind of experience that people have during that experiment to kind of inform and bias their subsequent kind of reward processing. And that's kind of in this diagram here, we regressed onto the striatal activations, the standard reward prediction errors from a non-moody model, and we compared that with our momentum biased or mood biased model, and we also regressed those onto the fMRI, and we were really interested in which model are people using. And I guess right off the bat, we expected that our control group are probably using a non-moody model, and that would best account for the striatal time series, whereas our folks with bipolar would be tracking the mood-biased reward prediction errors more so. So we had a first kind of confirmatory check here, right? So we wanted to know, this is some work from Hestia Moninka, who's a clinical fellow at UCL. We wanted to know that our estimates of mood in the model are being tracked, and she found good evidence that insula is sort of, the signal there is co-varying with people's mood throughout the experiment, which we are pretty happy about given the insula sort of role in sort of effective representation. And when we looked at, relating that to the kind of conceptually to our model, that it looks like this mood part is going on in insula activation. We then asked about the sort of second part, right, which is this sort of mood bias reward prediction errors, and where would they be represented? And what we found, in line with what we were predicting, is that in striatum there was only very weak evidence that healthy controls were tracking those mood biased reward prediction errors on top of standard reward prediction errors, and in bipolar disorder it looked like those signals are being well represented in that brain region. So I think overall what we were then intrigued about was how is it that mood is biasing these striatal reward prediction errors? And to kind of get at that question, we used functional connectivity to look at how much the ventral striatal region is talking to our kind of anterior insular region. And we kind of reasoned that if you have stronger coupling between those regions, there's a kind of greater passing of kind of the mood signals into the kind of striatal reward prediction errors. And that's really the opposite of what we found. So we found that there was stronger modulation of this sort of striatal insular connectivity in the healthy controls. So they seem to kind of, whenever the, again, we're kind of looking at the modulation of this connectivity by mood. What we found is when mood is kind of more positive, so there's a sort of upward momentum, this connectivity strengthened in the controls, and if anything, became more negative in the bipolar participants. So we were a little bit puzzled by that, and this is still emerging data. We've still fully to get our head around it. Sorry, let me move on. Yeah. So the explanation that we're running with at the moment, but I would really kind of value some feedback about, is perhaps this sort of coupling with anterior insula seems to sort of, it serves to contextualize rather than to bias the striatal raw perception. So there's something about being able to hold in mind your affect at that moment, as represented in insula, with the processing of raw British arrows and striatum. And it's a bit of a hand-wavy kind of explanation because at the end of the day, either directional result has a sort of explainable cause. But I guess what we would like to do is unpick that a bit more in our subsequent experiments by asking people about their estimates of momentum as well. But running with that sort of more speculative explanation for a moment, what we found was the amount that connectivity diverged in the bipolar participants was correlated with manic symptoms. So the more residual manic symptoms that participants had, the more they had this sort of divergent negative coupling between those two brain regions. So we think that perhaps that sort of hangs together quite well, that during periods of upward momentum, if you're someone who has some residual manic symptoms, you're less able to kind of contextualize or hold in mind your mood when processing the outcomes. So yeah, this is very new. Hestia just pre-printed this yesterday. So apologies if I haven't yet fully articulated our thinking on this. If there's any questions, let me know. Otherwise, yeah, I guess what we can conclude from this is hopefully that model-based fMRI is a pretty precise tool for like parsing these inconsistent findings in the real-world literature. We seem to implicate like very dopaminergically innervated regions in the brain and circuits in the brain for mood instability. And just wanted to say that in this sample, when I collected it many moons ago, by design, we didn't include people who were on antipsychotic medications because we reasoned that that would dampen or kind of obscure any effects on their processing of rewards. So it would be intriguing now, especially given that that class of medication has really taken off for the treatment of bipolar, to see whether dopamine medications act to offset this sort of bias that we see in striatal connectivity with insula. So next steps for this project, we actually recorded simultaneous EEG in these participants, and we've been scratching our head for quite a long time about how to integrate that and fuse that with the fMRI data. So Laura Moreno-Carbonell has been looking at that, and we're looking to wrap that work up soon as well. And I should say Laura's now a grad student here at Stanford, which I'm very happy about. Okay, so my last slide, if I still have the time, is just to sort of think about how this kind of relates to maybe sort of precision mental health. So I was asked to write an editorial about kind of making psychological therapies a bit more mechanism focused, which allow me to do some sort of pie in the sky thinking about how we might imagine that looking. So yeah, in terms of the sort of treatment journey that people might experience in the clinic, we of course have some formulations, so it's a medical assessment and psychological assessment. And of course, it would be wonderful to imagine a world in which some of these measures sort of factor into that assessment and into kind of how we're understanding patients' difficulties. In this paper, we sort of reasoned that that might be useful for kind of stratification or therapy tailoring, and that it might also be useful for sort of parameter to track kind of change and effect of therapy through changes in parameters in the task, and so things like the mood bias parameter that I mentioned before. And ultimately, that might give us a sort of earlier readout of change and to kind of help us, kind of with the patient journey. I would say that although we're a very, very long way from this, we're getting some kind of promising results in our longitudinal studies. So this is grad student Quentin Desson, who was looking at kind of the stability of these parameters from our tasks, even with this very brief sort of 5-minute probe that we use. I can see that on the x-axis, the days in study is slightly obscure, but they're in the study for about 9 days. And what he found was the parameters are pretty reliable, that we're able to kind of recover them. And that is a sort of first step in a sort of the holy grail, I guess, to using those as kind of outcome measures, I should say, for change. We want to see that there's stability in those parameters and that they, that we're getting some reliable capturing of things in the experiments. So to conclude, in my clinic that I head over at UCL, the Libra clinic for folks with bipolar disorder, we're starting to think about using some of our assessments, so smartphone-based assessments using these tasks, but also using ecological momentary assessment. And in my collaboration with Sherry Johnson and JD Allen at UC Berkeley, we're looking at deploying, again, these measures within a 8-week intervention for emotion-related impulsivity. So that's all I'm going to say for now. Hopefully there's plenty of time for questions. So thank you very much. And thank you to the lab members whose work I've shown today, and to my collaborators and sponsors as well. Thank you. Any questions?
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Mason. And I will just go around and ask if people have questions with the microphone. And no, I will go with the audience first, so you get the chance. So here's the first question.
Thank you so much. That was really fascinating. I have several thoughts. One is for the precision angle, it also seems important that you're unpacking the individual differences beyond the average. And that makes me think there's hope for the stratification or that baseline identification of risk. So on that, one question was, when you're looking at the average being too blunt, when you're looking at the reward responses, are you thinking of that being too blunt across people as well as within each person's time series? Is it both, or because you're separating on hypomanic traits, so I'm wondering if you also can separate on the imaging.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah, so I think it's definitely blunt at the group level for the reasons I was mentioning during the fMRI work. I think that like the nice thing about having these sort of short probes is each day or each week we're able to kind of capture that propensity, and I guess what we want to be able to see is that that is affected by intervention and is predictive of, for example, fluctuations in the mood symptoms and things like that. I don't have too much to kind of offer in the way of like our progress with that, other than in the SSRI study that I mentioned before, and it would be great if I had some backup slides for this. What we found was that the mood bias parameter was actually also affected by those SSRIs, even in healthy participants, and we saw that within a really short time frame of just a few days. So I think the ideal thing is that we were able to capture that within person variability. And yeah, I think there it's more a question of sort of predicting treatment response more so than kind of stratification. But yeah,
great. Two other quick points. I want others to have a chance. For the apparent decoupling you have of the insular and stratum, do you have a chance to look at the timing of the responses? I'm wondering if I'm thinking of it from the point of view of whether the response to negative stimuli or the negative bias is faster potentially than the positive, and whether that's different in your bipolar group. So the time series are decoupled temporarily.
Interesting.
That's one thought. And the last one is I really like the GEM reward for the reason that in thinking about how do you take monetary rewards into clinical application, it's presenting, we've been thinking about presenting a very practical issue of you can't offer the patients money if you're now in a clinic setting.
Right.
So we need to think about what's a salient reward that isn't money. So maybe it's gems.
No, that's really interesting, both points, and I think we could definitely do more to look at the kind of time course of that coupling between brain regions. And I think the EEG that we've recorded as well, we're kind of thrilled at the prospect of being able to get at the sort of dynamics of this more so. To your second point, I guess something that I didn't present today, but I think is also super relevant, because I think both you and Nia have sort of astutely recognized that the monetary reward will kind of only get you so far. So in the game, we've made that more portable and taken that dimension somewhat from it. But the other thing that we've been working really hard on is this sort of not just real life tracking of mood, but of real life reward prediction errors. So within this smartphone platform, we we're able to ask our participants to predict how like events that day are going to go. And essentially we can kind of formalize that as a reward prediction. And then we ask them what time is it happening and how did it go? And that's a sort of reward outcome. And we're able to derive from that a kind of what I like to think of as like an ecological reward prediction error. And we're doing some work at the moment to fit these same models to that kind of real life data. And I think that's going to get us a lot further than in terms of sort of, you know, the validity and generalizability of these sorts of effects.
We have a question from the online attendees. So Dr. Brian Knudson says, remarkable, negative connectivity of anterior insula and the nucleus accumbens is exactly what we would predict, but also in controls. What lag are you modeling, e.g. simultaneous, and at what temporal resolution, e.g. TR length?
So in terms of the lag, I mean, so this is all going on within the kind of outcome event, right? So they get the reward outcome. There's a 3-second event for that, and we're just taking the connectivity over the whole of that event. The second question was about the TR.
Yes, the TR length.
Yeah, I think, well, the TR of this acquisition was something like 2.5 seconds, but I can't remember exactly. But I would love to hear more about the sort of ideas behind those questions, because
thank you.
Brian is obviously very, very familiar with these tasks and acquisition protocols.
And Brian has some very beautiful data looking at the interaction between the anterior insula and the nucleus accumbens when it comes to stimulant relapse prediction, stimulant use disorder. So maybe that helps where some of this comes from.
Fantastic.
Are there any other questions from the audience here?
Thank you. And thanks for the talk too. It's really encouraging to see people looking mechanistically at the symptoms rather than just kind of assuming all occurring independently in some constellation. So it seems really important to be able to disentangle this, and you know more about that than I do, so I won't go further onto that end. I guess I was wondering about two different things. The first is the specificity of the finding, and I'm wondering maybe in one of those larger data sets that you have to be online stuff, even though if it's a little bit messier, if you can get at this through those data. And I guess I'm wondering because it seems also plausible that rather than something specific to bipolar and the kind of cycle between mood and reward prediction error, that across the board, it seems like people who are more mentally ill are more vulnerable to having their mood manipulated, which could be specific to bipolar. And I'm sure there's stuff in the literature I'm unfamiliar with, but it also could be a general feature of mood disorder.
Right.
So I guess the first question is on that. And the second is more future oriented. I can ask that now, or I can shut up and let you answer whatever's better for you.
Given my working memory being at an all-time low right now, let me go for the first one. I think, it's very likely that that is the case, right? That there's, you know, if you're someone who's prone to your moods going up or down and getting stuck in those kinds of cycles, I think it's very likely that this is something that we would see, for example, in folks with unipolar depression or MDD for sure. So my collaborator, Rob Rutledge over at Yale, is certainly looking at that in an NIHA grant at the moment. We don't have any immediate data on that. We certainly, in these large data sets, collect, for example, clinical symptoms, so depression symptoms, as well as hypomanic and manic symptoms. But yeah, I think what it's crying out for is sort of to look at this a bit more transdiagnostically in a few different data sets. So thank you.
Yeah, that totally makes sense, because it also could not change any of the conclusions. It could just be a true transdiagnostic. Anyways, thank you for answering that. Yeah. The second question, which I guess is more future studies oriented, is it makes a lot of sense to have a path model figured out, and it looked like the recurrent model was doing much better, at least by the BIC metric. I guess I'm wondering, in addition to the weights that you ascribe to each path, if there's room for additional personalization to individuals for unpacking some of the individual differences and fundamentally altering the path structure rather than just the weights, or if there is some type of space open where it allows for more individual flexibility than the weights between each path, which seems like a very needed first step and fruitful first step too.
Yeah, for sure. So I didn't show the sort of full model space that we compared. So, you know, there are probably a couple of dozen models with various different paths that we kind of tested fairly exhaustively. So that does allow us to sort of think about different paths and different mechanisms. And I guess to your question here as well around this idea of is confidence also kind of recursively biasing in a sort of, this idea of like a confirmation bias? There's a bunch of other opportunities here that weren't the best fitting model at the group level, but may well be a better fitting model for subgroups or subpopulations of our participants. So yeah, we're still perfecting our craft, I guess, with our kind of optimal like modeling approach to these kinds of questions. But now we've got our hands on some larger data. I think it's really exciting to be able to test between these sort of fine-tuned differences between the various models, for sure.
Cool. That totally makes sense. Thanks so much.
Cool. Thank you for the question.
So I just want you to talk just a little bit more about your thoughts on trait versus state when it comes to these models, because on the one hand, you talked about what sounded like trait is kind of vulnerability to, mood instability to bipolar.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, it sounds like for your fMRI imaging, you're looking at specific moments in the task, and it's not so much what I was maybe expecting to see was more resting, fMRI connectivity analyses and the baseline, period that predicts how they're going to respond, even either behaviorally or mood wise.
Yeah.
So just talk a little bit more about is this a trait thing, a state thing, some combination, or how are you thinking?
Yeah. So for a long time, I was trying to pass the sort of fMRI findings of, thinking about there being a trait or kind of core feature of kind of reward responsivity in folks with bipolar, and then sort of superimpose on top of that, if they're manic, it's sort of, modulated in one way, and if they're depressed, it's sort of dampened down in another way. I think the nice thing, about these models is I guess the case that we have put forward is the trait aspect is the propensity for mood at a given moment to bias your raw perception, and the state aspect is just whatever your mood is at that moment. So in the fMRI time series, people are obviously not experiencing full-blown manic episodes and then depressive episodes, but what we kind of predict in the model is their propensity for mood to bias perception is consistent throughout, and their mood is sort of oscillating, up and down to a small degree throughout the experiment. And so you have this sort of state effect of momentary mood at that moment. And I guess, like, how do you get from that to kind of, mood episodes that are on a much longer time series? And I think that bit is trickier, and it's something that we're trying to. It's another reason why we're sort of using this EMA piece to kind of bridge the timescale of momentary mood within, just minutes or hours of being in the scanner magnet to sort of like days and weeks outside of the, outside the scanner. So I guess the assumption of the model is that kind of momentary mood is a sort of building block. And per the kind of recursive model they showed at the beginning, that building block can kind of snowball into larger kind of full episodes, I guess. So I'm not sure if that fully answers your question, but yeah.
Cool. I had a question. Sorry. Thank you for the fantastic talk. It's so interesting, and I find this model extremely fascinating. My question is, like, if you were to apply, say, this model and adapt it to unipolar depression, for example, do you think, like, which components of the model do you think you would change, or how would you make, for example, the mood bias asymmetric, like maybe weighing more on the negative side, or are there other model parameters that you think would be different?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I want to kind of optimistically say that this model would kind of fit almost off the shelf, right? I think, as you said, we would expect the kind of mood bias parameter to be asymmetric in the extent that it's having a much larger, biasing effect under moments when people's mood is negative than under kind of moments when their mood is positive. So with a sort of fairly small tweak, you could we would have the model fit two different mood bias parameters, one for when mood is positive and one for when it is negative. And I guess what we'd be expecting is in folks with MDD, it's just a much larger bias under the latter case. Yeah.
You think there's mechanistic evidence for there being separate systems in the sense that we give antipsychotics for folks who are in a manic episode. They're very much ineffective for those who are in a depressive episode, generally speaking. And so you'd think that that's one piece of evidence for brain circuits that seem to be involved, probably are more in the dopaminergic circuits are probably more involved in this positive vicious cycle than in the negative one.
Yeah, so it's not exactly my wheelhouse in terms of like medication classes, but yeah, I think you're right. It does seem from that literature that that there might be some decoupling of these or separation of these kind of circuits. yeah, I guess we're, the regions that we implicate have kind of made a bit of a case that they're heavily dopaminergic, but of course they have inputs from kind of other neurotransmitters and serotonergic systems as well. So yeah, I guess that's kind of like, that was probably the genesis of our kind of projects looking at SSRIs on the one hand, predominantly serotonergic versus L-DOPA, and kind of being more dopaminergic. Maybe that data will kind of help us like wrangle with that a little bit. Maybe not.
A quick follow-up thought on that, and Leonardo's question is, in unipolar, because of the emerging evidence for low mood being more insular and negative, but then anhedonia being ventral stratum, it seems your model is ideally suited to model that. Like, is it low mood as well as lack of positive bias, as not necessarily one and the same thing in a unipolar state?
Yeah, it's intriguing, and I think, yeah, like we've barely scratched the surface in terms of like thinking about anhedonia and apathy and other dimensions of reward, right? I presented quite a simplified view of kind of rewards in this one context, but clinically we know it's more multifaceted than that. Yeah, that would be intriguing to kind of unpick a bit more. Again, with the kind of momentary sort of daily life reward prediction errors, we're hoping to kind of get a bit more of firstly making mood more multidimensional, right? We sample a bunch of different mood states and motivational states rather than just how happy are you right now, which is some smushing together of many of them. And similarly, in the reward domain, we can ask people a variety of different dimensions of reward about their daily life events. So you say you're meeting a friend to go to the park, like, we can ask them how enjoyable they think that will be and have a sort of enjoyment domain of that, or a sort of, hedonic domain of it. There's also the sort of closeness and connectedness that they might feel with that person. There's also a sense of achievement. So there's a bunch of nice ways in which you could kind of diversify the model a little bit that might go to, to some of those questions. Yeah.
Okay. Are there any other questions? Okay. If not, thank you again, Dr. Mason, for the great presentation. And we'll wrap up here. And we thank also all the people who joined us on Zoom. We will conclude the webinar. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.